Jake Morrison sat alone at the corner table and waited for his date to arrive. The coffee shop was called Stellar Grounds, and it floated in space on a station where many different alien species came to meet and trade. Jake looked at his watch again and saw that it was already past 11 at night. His date was very late now, and he started to worry that maybe she would not come at all. He had never met Alexis Chen in person before tonight. They only knew each other through military messages and sometimes video calls when the rules allowed them to talk. Alexis worked on the far side of a big nebula in space, and Jake worked somewhere else very far away. They almost never had time to meet, but both of them got some time off from work at the same time. Station Meridian was exactly in the middle between where they both worked, so they decided to meet here. It felt like something special was bringing them together. But now Alexis was not here, and Jake felt foolish for waiting so long. The alien server came to his table again. The server was a Vendorian who looked like he was made of crystal and had many eyes. He wore a special collar that changed his clicking sounds into English words. The server could see that Jake was still sitting alone, and he seemed to feel sorry for him. The server asked if Jake wanted more coffee. Jake smiled, but it was not a real smile. He said no thank you and told the server he was ready to leave. Jake took out his credit chip to pay for the food he ordered, but never ate, and the 3 cups of coffee that got cold while he waited. Right at that moment, the door made a chiming sound. 2 men walked into the coffee shop and everyone turned to look at them. They were human men who looked exactly the same. They were twins with dark skin and very smart-looking eyes. Both of them wore regular clothes, but they moved like soldiers. They walked together in perfect time, like they had practiced their steps. Their eyes looked around the room very carefully, the way soldiers always watch for danger. Then their eyes found Jake and stopped moving. Jake felt his hand stop moving as he was reaching for his credit chip. Something about these 2 men made all his soldier instincts wake up and pay attention. They walked straight to his table with purpose in every step. When they reached him, they stood very straight with their hands behind their backs. It was the way soldiers stand when they are waiting for orders. The twin on the left spoke first, and his voice was calm and professional. He asked if Jake was Commander Morrison. Jake said yes, that was him, but his voice sounded worried. He asked who they were. The twin on the right spoke next, and his voice sounded exactly like his brother. He said his name was Marcus Webb, and he was a lieutenant. He pointed to his brother and said his name was Daniel Webb, and he was also a lieutenant. Jake must have looked very confused because Marcus kept talking without waiting. Both twins spoke at exactly the same time and said that their dad sends his apologies. Jake just stared at them for a moment. He did not understand what was happening at all. Finally, he asked them what they were talking about. Daniel took out a small computer pad and placed it on the table. He pushed it toward Jake very carefully. Daniel said he knew this was not what Jake expected tonight. He said they felt just as uncomfortable giving this message as Jake probably felt. Hearing it, Jake looked at the computer pad like it might explode. He told them he was expecting a date with Commander Chen and not whatever this was. Marcus pointed at the empty chairs at the table. He asked if they could sit down because this would take some time to explain. Jake was still trying to understand what was going on, but he nodded. Yes. The twins sat down and they moved at exactly the same time again. It was strange but also kind of impressive. They had clearly spent their whole lives doing everything together. Marcus started talking and said that Commander Alexis Chen was their father. Jake almost choked on nothing. He said that was impossible because Alexis was a woman and he had seen her many times. Daniel nodded and said, yes. Jake had seen the person who calls herself Commander Alexis Chen. But that identity was fake and not real. Their real father was Admiral Gregory Lawson. The name hit Jake like someone had punched him. Admiral Gregory Lawson was a legend in the military. He was a genius who won 3 big battles against their enemy, which was an alien race. Called the Kryn, he invented new ways of fighting that everyone studied in military school. But Admiral Lawson was also supposed to be dead. Jake said slowly that Lawson died 4 years ago. His ship was destroyed during a big battle at a place called Kepler Station. Marcus agreed and said that was what all the official records say. Those records needed to stay official, which is why the twins came here instead of their father. Jake leaned back in his chair and his mind was racing with thoughts. He said slowly that they were telling him Admiral Lawson faked his own death. Then he pretended to be a woman named Commander Chen. And then he tricked Jake for 6 whole months. Daniel looked uncomfortable when Jake said it that way. He said that was not completely wrong, but their dad would say it differently. The relationship Jake developed was real and genuine. The feelings were real and true, only the identity was false. Jake felt hurt and angry now. He asked why this happened. Why did Lawson lie to him? Why not just tell him the truth? Marcus touched the computer pad on the table. He said everything was explained in the pad. Their dad had been working on something very important that could change the whole war with the Kryn. But it needed to be completely secret, so he had to stop being Admiral Lawson anymore. Daniel continued the story. He said that during the time their dad was hiding his identity, he made contact with Jake during some joint military work. He never planned to have feelings for anyone. Jake was supposed to be just another officer he worked with. But Jake impressed him very much. His smart thinking and his dedication and his humanity when other people became cold and uncaring. Jake felt his anger getting softer, even though he did not want it to. He remembered those early talks with Alexis, or really with Lawson, the way they connected when they complained about stupid rules, how they both loved old Earth military history, how they made dark jokes about the crazy things that happened in war. Jake asked why they sent the twins. Why not just cancel the date? Why not just disappear and never talk to him again? The twins looked at each other. For the first time since they arrived, they did not move perfectly together. Marcus spoke first, and his voice was softer now. He said it was because their dad needed Jake to help him, and because he respected Jake too much to just vanish without an explanation. Jake picked up the computer pad from the table. The screen glowed softly in the dim light of the coffee shop. The file on it was locked with very strong military security. It needed both his fingerprint and a special password that only he would know. The password was a private joke he shared with Alexis. No one else in the whole universe would know that joke. That more than anything else made Jake believe this was all real. He typed in the password and the file opened up. What he saw made his blood feel cold in his veins. He whispered that it was a Kryn neural mapping station. They had found one. The Kryn had been the enemy of humanity for 15 years. They were a species that shared one big mind together. All their individual bodies were connected through something called quantum entanglement. Human scientists still did not really understand how it worked. That shared mind made them very dangerous. They could plan attacks with perfect timing. They could change their tactics instantly. They never had problems with communication, no matter how far apart their ships were. The neural mapping stations were their command centers. They were rare places where the hive mind became stronger and could give better orders. Destroying one could mess up Kryn operations across a whole sector of space, but they were also protected impossibly well. They were buried deep in enemy territory, protected by huge fleets that would destroy any normal attack. Daniel explained that their dad found this station 3 years ago. That was when he faked his death. He needed to disappear so he could work on a way to destroy it. A way that would not make the Kryn attack back with everything they had. Jake looked through all the data on the pad. He saw drawings and maps and patrol routes and defense systems. Everything was documented very carefully. It must have taken years of dangerous spy work to collect all this information. Marcus said that their dad had a plan, but the plan needed someone with specific skills. Specifically, Jake's skills. Jake looked up from the pad. He said he was just a frigate commander. He ran patrols and protected supply ships. What could he possibly do for something? This big Daniel said that Jake also survived something called the Proxima ambush. Jake kept his crew alive for 72 hours behind enemy lines. He had no backup and no extra supplies. His ship was barely working. He made weapons out of mining equipment. He turned a civilian cargo ship into a fighting vessel. Their dad read Jake's report about it a dozen times. He said what Jake did should not have been possible. The memory of Proxima made Jake's jaw get tight. Those 3 days were the worst days of his life. 6 members of his crew died. He still saw their faces sometimes when he closed his eyes, but those days also proved something important. Humanity could win through pure stubborn cleverness. Even when they had less weapons and were outmaneuvered, Marcus said the plan needed someone who could think outside normal military rules. Someone who understood that sometimes the best military solution was not military at all. That person was Jake. Jake put the pad down on the table. He asked what happened if he said no. The twins did not wait even a second to answer. Daniel said they would walk away. Their dad was very clear about this. This was a request and not an order. Jake had every right to be angry about being lied to. If he wanted nothing to do with this mission, or with Lawson, they would understand. Marcus added quietly that they hoped Jake would not say no because the information their dad gathered showed the Kryn were planning something very big. This neural station was the key to whatever they were preparing. If humans did not act soon, they might not get another chance. Jake closed his eyes. He thought about Alexis, the late-night conversations, the times they laughed together, the growing feeling that maybe he had found someone who really understood him. All of it was built on a lie, but it also felt real. If Daniel was right and the feelings were real even when the identity was fake, then maybe the lie did not destroy everything they shared. Besides, Jake was a soldier. Personal feelings always came second to duty. Jake opened his eyes and looked at the twins. He told them to explain the plan to him. The twins led Jake to a private docking bay on the far side of Station Meridian security. Here was very tight. Only military people were allowed. Even Jake's commander papers got checked twice before they let him through. Inside the bay was a ship that Jake had never seen before. It was small and about the size of a frigate, but its outer shell was covered in strange flat panels that seemed to eat light instead of bouncing it back. There were no visible weapons and no normal engine signatures. It looked more like a piece of art than a warship. Jake asked if this was what he thought it was. His voice was barely louder than a whisper. Marcus said, if Jake thought it was a full stealth ship using Kryn technology, then yes, he was right. Dad had been building it for 2 years. The outer shell had special dampeners that could make them basically invisible to Kryn sensors. Jake felt doubt fighting with amazement. He said the Kryn did not use cloaking technology. They did not need it. Quantum communication meant they always knew where their own units were. Daniel said that was correct, but their dad realized that was actually their weakness. They relied so much on their neural network that their other sensors were pretty basic. They assumed anything coming near them was either a friend or an obvious enemy. They never developed ways to fight stealth because they never needed to. The boarding ramp came down with a soft hissing sound. As they climbed aboard, Jake saw that the inside was just as unusual as the outside. Every surface was covered with screens showing real-time data from dozens of places. The crew stations were arranged in a circle around a central projector. This created a view all around them in every direction, and standing at the center of it all was Commander Alexis Chen, or rather Admiral Gregory Lawson. The disguise was perfect. Lawson wore a female body with the ease of someone who had lived in it for years. The holographic skin was seamless. The voice changer could not be detected, but the eyes were the same. Those sharp, calculating eyes that Jake had seen in 100 video calls. Lawson spoke and thanked Jake for coming. His voice still had Alexis Chen's sound. Jake did not know what to say. He had practiced a dozen angry speeches on the walk over, but standing in front of the man who deceived him made the anger melt away into something more complicated. He felt hurt, yes, and confused definitely, but also a grudging respect for the sheer boldness of what Lawson had done. Jake finally asked why the disguise, why not just recruit him as Lawson? Lawson pointed to a seat and Jake sat down. He still could not match the woman's body with the legendary Admiral's identity. Lawson explained that Gregory Lawson could not contact Jake. He was dead. Any hint that he was not dead would have ruined 3 years of work, but Alexis Chen could reach out. She was a mid-level commander with no special importance. She could ask for a routine coordination meeting without making anyone suspicious. Jake pressed harder. He asked about the relationship. Was that just part of the cover too? Lawson's expression got softer. For a moment, Jake could see real emotion under the disguise. Lawson said no. That was never part of any plan. He genuinely admired Jake's work and his thinking and his character. The feelings that grew were real even if the identity was false. Jake wanted to stay angry. He wanted to hold on to his wounded pride, but he could hear the truth in Lawson's voice. He knew enough about people to recognize honesty when he heard it. Instead of arguing, Jake told Lawson to show him the plan. The holographic projector lit up, showed the Kryn neural station in 3 dimensions. It was massive, a sprawling complex that looked more like a city than a military base. Thousands of Kryn units moved through it in perfect coordination. Their quantum link showed up as glowing threads connecting every individual to the whole. Lawson began to explain. A direct attack would be suicide even with stealth technology. They could not get close enough to plant regular explosives. The station's defenses were too smart and too backed up with redundancy. Jake asked how they would destroy it. Then Lawson smiled. It was a smile Jake recognized from tactical briefings, the smile of someone who found an elegant answer to an impossible problem. Lawson said they would not destroy it. They would make the Kryn destroy it themselves. Lawson explained that the plan relied on understanding Kryn psychology. They were a hive mind, which meant they thought in consensus. Individual Kryn units had very little independent thinking. They were more like biological computers, connected to a central network. Jake said that made them predictable. Lawson agreed in some ways. Yes, but more importantly, they had a critical weakness. Their neural network was incredibly efficient, but it was also fragile. Introduce the right kind of feedback loop and errors could cascade through the entire system. The key was a device Lawson developed over 3 years of careful research, a quantum disruptor that could connect with the Kryn neural network. It would introduce a specific type of error, not something obvious like a virus, but subtle corruption, a logical paradox wrapped in Kryn communication codes. Lawson continued, explaining the Kryn mind processed information through consensus. Every decision was made by millions of nodes agreeing on the best course of action. But what happens when you introduce a question that has no consensus answer? Jake understood immediately. A paradox, something that could not be solved through their normal way of making decisions. Lawson said exactly right. The disruptor would inject a quantum-level contradiction into their network. They would try to resolve it through consensus, but every attempt would create more contradictions. The errors would compound and spread through every connected node like a chain reaction. Jake asked what happens when the errors reach critical mass. Lawson explained they would start emergency protocols, which meant shutting down all non-essential systems and deleting corrupted data. Since the neural station itself was the source of corruption, their own protocols would identify it as compromised. They would destroy their own command node to protect the integrity of the greater network. It was brilliant. Humanity could not destroy the station through force, so they would trick the Kryn into destroying it through their own defense systems, but first they had to plant the disruptor. 3 days later, Jake found himself strapped into the co-pilot seat of the stealth ship. He watched the Kryn neural station grow larger on the view screen. The journey through Kryn space had been terrifying. Every time they passed a patrol, every time they got close to a sensor net, Jake expected alarms to sound and weapons to fire, but the stealth technology held. The Kryn simply could not see them. Marcus reported from the navigation station that they had 5 minutes to the insertion point. Daniel sat at weapons, though the console was mostly empty. Their only weapons were defensive countermeasures. This mission would succeed through trickery, not firepower. Lawson, still wearing the Alexis Chen disguise, piloted with steady hands. The station was even more impressive up close. Massive organic structures pulsed with glowing light. They were grown rather than built. They housed thousands of Kryn minds, all working in perfect harmony. Daniel announced they were approaching the weak point. Their spy work had found a maintenance shaft that led to the station's core network hub. It was too small for Kryn units to easily get into, which meant security was lighter there, just light enough for a small team to sneak in. The ship docked with barely a whisper of contact. Magnetic clamps engaged and created an airtight seal. Jake checked his environment suit one last time, then he nodded to the others. They were as ready as they would ever be. The airlock opened and they entered the Kryn station. The inside was like stepping into an alien nightmare. Organic walls moved with rhythmic contractions. Glowing veins carried nutrients and neural signals through the structure. The air was thick with humidity and strange chemical smells. They made Jake's nose burn even through his suit's filters. They moved in silence, following the mapped route Lawson had so carefully planned. Every turn and every Junction had been studied. They knew exactly where to go, exactly how long they had before patrol. Patterns brought Kryn units through this section: 12 minutes to reach the core hub, 8 minutes to install the disruptor, 10 minutes to get out, 30 minutes total with almost no room for mistakes. They reached the hub with 2 minutes to spare. The core hub was amazing in its alien beauty. A vast room where thousands of neural threads came together into one central point. Energy flowed through those threads in visible pulses, like a massive brain laid open for everyone to see. This was where the Kryn hive mind focused its collective thinking, where orders were sent out and information was put together. It was also terrifyingly open: one patrol or one random sensor check, and they would be found. There would be no escape. No fighting there, way out against a coordinated hive mind that could send thousands of units at them. Lawson ordered Marcus and Daniel to watch their backs. The twins moved to the entry points with their weapons ready, even though they knew the weapons would be useless in a real fight. Jake moved with Lawson to the central point where all the threads met. Lawson took the disruptor out of a secured case. It was surprisingly small. No larger than a human fist, but its surface was covered with quantum processors that hurt to look at directly. The technology inside was barely understood even by the person who made it. It connected with reality at a level that made human scientists cry in frustration. Lawson told Jake he needed him to splice the connection. He pointed at a place where several neural threads came together. Lawson said his hands were not as steady as they used to be. Jake took the device and felt its strange weight. It seemed to pulse in his hands, moving at frequencies his nerves could barely feel. He went to the junction point with tools in hand. He focused on the delicate task ahead. Splicing into a Kryn neural network was like performing surgery on something alive. The threads were not cables. They were living tissue that carried signals connected by quantum entanglement. Touch them wrong and they would react, alerting the hive mind to the intrusion. But cut them correctly, and you could insert something foreign before they even registered. The break Jake's hands moved with practiced precision. Years of field repairs and fixing damaged ships with bad tools had taught him patience and care. He made the first cut. The neural thread split without setting off any alarm. The second cut and the third, each one clean and careful. Daniel whispered from his position that there was contact. A patrol was coming, and they had 2 minutes. Jake forced himself to stay calm. Rushing would only cause errors. He continued the splice, connecting the disruptor's quantum interface to the exposed neural threads. The device began to sync with the network, its processors adapting to the Kryn communication codes. Marcus updated that they had 1 minute. The final connection clicked into place. The disruptor came fully online. Jake could see its effect right away. The neural threads around it began to pulse in wrong patterns. The quantum paradox spread through the network, not obvious enough to set off immediate alarms, but subtle corruption that would grow worse over time. Jake stepped back and said it was done. They needed to leave right now. They moved quickly but carefully back through the corridors. The patrol was close now, close enough that they could hear the clicking sounds of Kryn communication, but their timing held. They slipped past the patrol's route by seconds, reaching the airlock just as the patrol entered the section they had just left. The ship pulled away from the station with practiced silence as they moved away. Jake watched the neural station on the view screen, looking for any sign that their break-in had been found. Nothing. The station continued its normal work, not knowing it now had a logical time bomb in its shared mind. Jake asked how long until the paradox reached critical mass. Lawson replied between 6 and 12 hours. The exact time depended on how fast the corrupted data spread through their network. But once it reached the threshold, their emergency protocols would start automatically. Jake sat in his seat and felt the rush of energy slowly drain from his body. They had done it. Against all odds, they had gone into the heart of a Kryn stronghold and planted their weapon. Now all they could do was wait and hope that humanity's ability for creative trickery could overcome the Kryn's advantage in raw coordination. 9 hours later, they watched from a safe distance as the Kryn neural station began to die. It started subtly. Patrol routes became strange and wrong ships launched and returned without clear purpose. Communications between units grew more frequent and more frantic. HiveMind tried to resolve the growing contradictions in its thinking. Lawson watched the sensor feeds with intense focus. He observed that the paradox was spreading faster than he predicted. They were trying to solve it through forcing agreement, which only made the corruption spread faster. Jake could see it in the data streams. Every CRIN unit connected to the neural network was now working on the same unsolvable problem. They were trying to reach agreement on a question that had no agreed answer. Every attempt to resolve it created new contradictions, which created more questions. It was beautiful in a terrible way. The very thing that made the CRIN so dangerous, their perfect coordination, had become their weakness. A human finding a logical paradox could simply choose to ignore it, to move on to other work. But the CRIN hive mind could not let it go. The unsolved question became like cancer in their shared thinking, demanding resolution, eating up more and more processing power as they tried to fix the unfixable. Daniel reported that emergency protocols were starting. The station was beginning core purge procedures on the view screen. The neural station's glow began to dim, sections went dark as the hive mind shut down compromised systems one by one. But the corruption was too deep and too basic. The entire station had become infected with the logical paradox, and so following protocols designed to protect the integrity of the greater CRIN network, the station did the only thing it could. It destroyed itself. The explosion was oddly quiet in the empty space. The organic structures broke apart from within. The station's own systems carefully took apart the compromised neural hub ships that had been docked, ran away in all directions. Their connection to the command network cut off. Some crashed into each other, their navigation corrupted by the spreading errors. Others simply turned off, their CRIN crews unable to work without the guiding intelligence of the hive mind. Within an hour, the entire complex was gone. Debris spread outward in a slow-motion cloud, the remains of what had been one of the CRIN's most important strategic places. Marcus reported that sensors were detecting massive problems across the sector. CRIN fleet movements were becoming uncoordinated. They were pulling back to defensive positions. Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They had done it. A single small team had done what entire battle fleets could not through better weapons, but through understanding the enemy's basic nature and using it against them. Jake asked quietly how many lives they just saved. Lawson thought about the question. He said millions potentially. The CRIN were using this station to coordinate attacks across 3 major fronts. Without it, those attacks would be delayed, maybe called off completely. They had bought humanity time to make defenses stronger, time to create new plans, time to find other weaknesses in the CRIN network. Time was the most valuable thing in any war. Jake turned to Lawson. He could see the Admiral clearly. How, despite the disguise, he asked what happened next. Lawson was still officially dead, and Jake was technically away from his post without permission to be here. Lawson smiled. He said that was the beauty of this operation. It was never official. No records. No chain of command. No paper trail. Jake was on leave meeting a friend. Lawson was dead. What they did here today never happened. Daniel added that the results were very real, though. High command would see the disruption in CRIN operations. They would investigate, eventually, piece together what happened. But by then the station would be a mystery. A lucky break that no one could quite explain. Jake asked, "What about them? What did they do?" Lawson met his eyes. He told Jake to go back to his post, continue doing what he did best, keeping his crew alive and pushing back against the CRINAs for Lawson himself. He paused. He said he would remain dead for now. 3 months later, Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his frigate. He watched the latest tactical updates from the front. Lines the CRIN were still struggling from the loss of their neural station. The big attack they had been planning never happened. Entire sectors that had been fought over were now becoming stable. Humanity pushed back with new strength. No one knew exactly why the tide had turned. The official reports said it was better coordination and new defensive plans. Some people who studied these things thought there were internal fights within the CRIN. Others suggested they had simply stretched themselves too thin and were pulling back. Jake knew the truth. A small team, an impossible mission, and humanity's greatest weapon, the ability to think in ways the enemy never expected. His personal communication device made a sound. It was an encrypted message. He looked at it and smiled despite himself. It was from Commander Alexis Chen, or rather from Admiral Gregory Lawson. The message was short, just a few words. It said, "Thank you for believing in the impossible. Same time next month. Dinner. No surprises. Promise." Jake found himself laughing. The boldness of it. The sheer human boldness. Lawson wanted to have dinner to keep their relationship going despite everything. Most people would call it crazy. But Jake had learned something important over the past few months. Sometimes, the most human thing you could do was embrace the craziness, trust in the impossible, and have faith that cleverness could overcome any obstacle. He typed his response, "Only if you show up as yourself this time." The reply came almost instantly, "Deal though. You might be disappointed. I am told I am much less attractive without the holographic disguise." Jake smiled, looking out at the stars. Somewhere out there the war continued. The Kryn still threatened humanity's survival, but they had proven something important. They had proven that humans could win, not through better numbers or better weapons, but through creativity, through being able to adapt, and through the willingness to think beyond normal limits. The Kryn were a hive mind, perfect and coordinated, but humanity was something the Kryn would never understand. Humanity was chaos and creativity. Individuals who could work together without losing themselves, who could form connections and relationships that went beyond logic. Humanity was messy and unpredictable, and brilliant. And that made all the difference. Lieutenant Kate Barnes came over from the sensor station. She said, "Sir, we have new orders from command. They want us to investigate some unusual readings near the Helios cluster." Jake nodded. He put away the personal messages and returned to duty. He told her to set their course and prepare the crew. If the Kryn taught them anything, it was that they needed to stay alert. Kate said, "Yes, sir." As the frigate turned toward its new direction, Jake allowed himself one more moment to think about the strange turn his life had taken. He had gone to a blind date expecting to meet someone interesting. Instead, he had helped win an important victory in a war that humanity had been losing, all because two black twins had walked into a coffee shop and said, "Dad sends his apologies." Life, Jake thought, was stranger than any tactical simulation, and sometimes that strangeness was exactly what you needed. The stars stretched out before them, full of dangers and mysteries, but also full of possibilities. And as long as humanity kept thinking, kept adapting, kept being beautifully and impossibly human, they would find a way through. They always did. Jake watched the view screen as they moved through space. His crew worked around him. With practiced efficiency, each person doing their job, each person trusting the others. That was humanity's real strength, not technology or weapons, but the ability to work together while staying individual, to coordinate without losing independence, to trust without becoming one. The Kryn would never understand that, and that was why humanity would ultimately win. A month passed and Jake found himself back at Station Meridian. This time he knew exactly what to expect, or at least he thought he did. He sat at the same corner table in Stellar Grounds. The Vendorian server recognized him and brought coffee without being asked. The alien's many eyes showed what might have been amusement. Jake checked the time, 11 at night again, the same time as before. He wondered if Lawson had a sense of humor about these things. The door chimed. Jake looked up, expecting to see the twins again. Instead, a single man walked in. He was older than Jake expected, maybe in his 60s, with gray hair and lines on his face that spoke of years of hard decisions. But those eyes, those were the same sharp, calculating eyes Jake had seen in video calls and on the stealth ship Admiral. Gregory Lawson walked to Jake's table without the disguise. He wore simple civilian clothes, nothing that would draw attention. But he moved with an authority that was impossible to hide completely. Lawson asked if he could sit. Jake gestured to the chair. He said he appreciated that Lawson kept his promise about no surprises. Lawson smiled as he sat down. He said he owed Jake that much. Besides, the holographic disguise was becoming uncomfortable. He had worn it for 3 years and was ready to be himself again, even if only for a few hours. They ordered food, and for a while they just talked. Not about the mission or the war, but about normal things. Books they had read, places they wanted to visit when the war ended, memories from before everything became about fighting. The Kryn. Jake found himself relaxing. This was the person he had gotten to know over months of messages and calls. The gender and appearance were different, but the mind and personality were the same. Eventually, the conversation turned more serious. Lawson told Jake about the years of planning, how he had faked his death during a battle where chaos made it easy to disappear, how he spent months studying Kryn psychology and technology looking for weaknesses that others had missed. The breakthrough came when he realized that Kryn's greatest strength was also their greatest vulnerability. Their hive mind made them powerful, but it also made them dependent on the network always working perfectly, dependent on being able to reach consensus, introduce something that could not be resolved through consensus, and the whole system would collapse. Jake asked why Lawson chose him for the mission. Out of all the officers in the fleet, why Jake Lawson leaned back in his chair. He said that most military officers were trained to think in specific ways. Follow the chain of command, use overwhelming force when possible. Stick to proven tactics. Those were good principles for most situations, but they were useless against the Kryn. The Kryn could adapt to any conventional tactic. They could coordinate better than any human force. They always had more ships and better positioning to beat them. You needed to think differently. Jake at Proxima had done exactly that. He did not try to fight the Kryn on their terms. He used what he had in ways they did not expect. Mining equipment became weapons. Civilian ships became combat vessels. Desperation became innovation. That kind of thinking was what Lawson needed. Someone who could see beyond the obvious. Someone who understood that the best solution was not always the most direct one. Jake nodded slowly. He understood, but he had another question. He asked about the relationship. The personal connection that developed. Had that been strategy? To Lawson's expression became serious. He said no. That was never part of the plan. He had reached out to Jake as Alexis Chen for purely professional reasons to evaluate him as a potential recruit. But somewhere in those conversations, something unexpected happened. Lawson found himself actually enjoying the talks, looking forward to them, sharing more than he needed to. For 3 years, he had been alone with his mission, unable to trust anyone, unable to be himself. With Jake, even through a disguise, he felt like he could be honest about what mattered, about ideas and principles and what they were fighting for. The identity might have been false, but everything else was real. Jake considered this. He asked what happened now. Would Lawson stay dead? Would they keep meeting in secret? Lawson said he did not know. There were other projects he was working on, other ways to exploit Kryn weaknesses. For now he needed to stay hidden, but eventually when the time was right, he might be able to return. The war was changing. The destruction of the neural station had proven that the Kryn were not invincible. Other commanders were starting to think more creatively, to look for unconventional solutions. Maybe in a year or two, Gregory Lawson could come back from the dead with a story about survival and hidden missions. Until then, he would continue his work in the shadows. Jake reached across the table. He said he would wait, however long it took, because what they had built together was worth preserving, even if it had started with a lie, even if it had to exist in secret. It was real, and that was what mattered. Lawson took Jake's hand. For a moment, the legendary admiral looked almost vulnerable. He said, "Thank you for understanding, for not walking away when Jake had every right to, for being exactly the kind of person Lawson hoped he would be." They finished their meal and talked until the coffee shop started closing. When they finally said goodbye, Lawson told Jake to stay safe, to keep thinking differently, keep being the officer who turned mining equipment into weapons, because humanity needed more people like that. Jake watched Lawson leave. The older man disappeared into the crowd on the station, just another civilian among thousands. No one would guess. He was one of humanity's greatest military minds working in secret to turn the tide of an impossible war. 6 months after the neural station's destruction, Jake's frigate was patrolling near the edge of human-controlled space. The sector had been quiet lately, too quiet according to some of his crew. But Jake knew that quiet meant the mission had worked. The Kryn were still reorganizing, still trying to compensate for the loss of their command node. Kate Barnes called out from her station, She said they were picking up a distress signal, human origin, coming from a mining outpost about 2 hours away at maximum speed. Jake ordered them to set course. He asked what the signal said. Kate frowned at her screen. She said it was fragmentary, something about Kryn scouts, and systems failing. The outpost had maybe 50 civilian miners. No military presence. No weapons to speak of. If Kryn were attacking, they would not last long. The frigate pushed its engines hard. 2 hours became 90 minutes, then an hour. When they arrived, the situation was worse than Jake feared. 3 Kryn scout ships circled the mining outpost, like sharks. The outpost's shields were failing, hull breaches in multiple sections. Life support was at 30%. Jake's tactical officer, Lieutenant Carl Hayes, ran the numbers. He said they were outgunned. 3 Kryn scouts against 1 frigate. The math was not in their favor. Normal doctrine would be to call for backup and wait, but backup was 3 hours away. The outpost did not have 3 hours. Jake studied the tactical display. The Kryn scouts were coordinating perfectly as always, taking turns, firing on the outpost, never exposing more than 1 ship to potential counterfire at a time. It was textbook Kryn tactics, efficient and methodical. But Jake had learned something important over the past months. The Kryn's perfect coordination was built on assumptions. They assumed their enemies would fight in predictable ways, would use their weapons as designed, would follow military doctrine. Jake looked at the mining outpost. It was built around a large asteroid. Mining equipment dotted its surface, including several large excavation charges, explosives designed to break apart rock. An idea formed. It was crazy, but crazy had worked before. Jake ordered weapons to target the excavation charges. Carl looked at him confused. He asked if Jake meant the Kryn ships. Jake said no, target the mining charges on the asteroid, and contact the outpost. Tell them to evacuate everyone to the far side of the asteroid immediately. The crew looked uncertain, but they followed orders. They had learned to trust their commander's unconventional thinking. The frigate came in fast. The Kryn scouts detected them and shifted their coordination. 2 moved to intercept while 1 continued attacking the outpost. Perfect Kryn tactics. Divide and conquer. But Jake was not interested in fighting them ship to ship. As the scouts moved in, Jake ordered fire on the mining charges. The frigate's weapons were not designed for precision shooting, but they did not need to be. The laser fire hit the first excavation charge. It detonated. A massive explosion designed to crack open asteroids. The force shattered part of the asteroid and sent huge chunks of rock flying in all directions. Jake ordered them to hit the second charge, then the third. Each explosion added more debris to the cloud forming around the asteroid. The Kryn scouts suddenly found themselves in a field of high-velocity projectiles, rocks the size of houses moving at lethal speeds. Their coordination meant nothing against simple physics. The first scout took a direct hit from a boulder and spun out of control. The second tried to dodge but ran straight into another chunk of debris. The third scout attempted to retreat, but the debris field was expanding too fast. Within minutes, all 3 Kryn ships were disabled or destroyed, not by weapons, but by turning the environment into a weapon. The crew on Jake's bridge sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then someone started clapping. Others joined in. Carl shook his head in amazement and said that should not have worked. Jake smiled and said it worked, because the Kryn never expected it. They coordinated against weapons fire and tactical maneuvers. They did not coordinate against someone turning mining equipment into an improvised minefield. Kate reported that the outpost was signaling all personnel were safe, minimal casualties. They were asking if Jake's crew could help with repairs. Jake said yes and ordered a damage control team to prepare. As his crew worked, he thought about Lawson, about their conversations regarding unconventional thinking. The Admiral had been right. The Kryn could be beaten. Not through matching their coordination, but through being unpredictable, through seeing possibilities they would never consider. That was humanity's true advantage. That night after the repairs were done, Jake sent an encrypted message. He did not know if Lawson would receive it. The Admiral moved in shadows now, working on projects Jake could only guess at. But Jake wanted Lawson to know what happened. The message was simple. It said used mining charges. Today just like at Proxima, but bigger. 3 Kryn scouts did not know what hit them. Your lessons are spreading. Others are starting to think differently too. Thank you for showing us how." The response came 3 days later. Just 2 words. "Well done." But those 2 words meant everything. 1 year after the mission to the Neural Station, Jake received orders that surprised him. He was being promoted to captain, not just promoted, but given command of a new ship-a-destroyer-class vessel, with twice the firepower of his old frigate. The orders came with a note from Fleet Command. They commended his innovative tactics, his ability to think beyond conventional doctrine, his success in situations where by all rights he should have failed. Jake read the orders and smiled. He wondered if Lawson had anything to do with this. Even dead, the Admiral seemed to have influence. The commissioning ceremony for his new ship was held at Fleet Headquarters on Earth. Jake had not been back to Earth in 3 years, standing on the surface, feeling real gravity, and real wind was strange after so long in space. His crew from the frigate came with him. Most of them had been promoted as well. Kate was now a full lieutenant. Carl had made senior lieutenant. They were all excited about the new ship and the missions to come. The ceremony was formal and full of speeches. Admirals talked about duty and sacrifice, about the turning tide of the war, about humanity's resilience in the face of an implacable enemy. Jake stood at attention and tried to look dignified, but his mind kept wandering. Thinking about a coffee shop on Station Meridian, about 2 twins who walked in saying Dad sends his apologies, about a mission that officially never happened. After the ceremony, there was a reception. Jake made small talk with officers he barely knew, accepted congratulations from people who wanted to be associated with success. He was reaching his limit of polite socializing when someone tapped his shoulder. He turned and saw Marcus and Daniel Webb. The twins wore full military dress. Uniforms now. They had been promoted too. Both were captains now like Jake. Marcus smiled and said congratulations. Daniel added that their father wanted to see Jake, if he had time. Jake felt his heart beat faster. He asked if Lawson was here on Earth. The twins nodded. They said there was a car waiting outside. If Jake wanted to slip away from the reception, Jake did not hesitate. He followed the twins out a side door. They drove for an hour into the countryside away from the city and the military bases. Eventually, they reached a small house overlooking a lake. It was peaceful and quiet. The kind of place where you could forget there was a war happening in the stars above. Lawson sat on the porch watching the sunset over the water. He wore civilian clothes and looked more relaxed than Jake had ever seen him. When Jake approached, Lawson stood and smiled. He said, "Congratulations, Captain." The promotion was well-deserved. Jake asked if Lawson had pulled strings to make it happen. Lawson laughed and said he wished he could take credit. But no, Jake earned this through his own actions. The mining outpost rescue had gotten attention, as had half a dozen other engagements where Jake won through cleverness instead of firepower. Fleet Command was finally starting to understand what Lawson had known for years, that beating the Kryn required a new kind of thinking. They sat together and watched the sun go down. After a while, Jake asked what Lawson had been doing this past year. Lawson said he had been working on several projects training small teams in unconventional warfare, developing new technologies that exploited Kryn weaknesses, building a network of officers who understood that creativity was as important as discipline. The Neural Station's destruction had proven his theories. Now others were listening, wanting to learn. Jake asked if Lawson would ever officially come back from the dead. Lawson thought about it. He said maybe someday, when the time was right, when his work in the shadows was done. For now, he was more useful as a ghost, able to move freely without bureaucratic oversight, able to take risks that an official admiral could never take. But he promised when the war turned, when humanity was truly winning, instead of just surviving, he would return. Jake said he would wait, as long as it took. Lawson reached over and took Jake's hand. He said he never expected to find this. When he started his mission, he thought he would be alone forever. But Jake had become something unexpected. Not just an ally in the fight against the Kryn, but someone who understood him, someone who saw beyond the disguise and the deception to the person underneath. That was worth more than any military victory. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out, up there somewhere. The war continued. Ships fought and died. The Kryn pressed their advantages, humanity pushed back with growing confidence. But here by the lake there was peace. A moment of calm between two people who had found each other in the chaos. Eventually, Jake would have to return to his new ship, and his crew Lawson would disappear back into the shadows. Continue his work changing the war from behind the scenes, but they would stay connected through encrypted messages and occasional secret meetings, through a bond that started with deception but became something real and true. Jake thought about that first night at Stellar Grounds, sitting alone, waiting for a date that never came. Then two twins walking in with an impossible message he had been angry at. First felt betrayed and used, but now he understood. Sometimes the best things in life started in the strangest ways. Sometimes you had to go on a blind date that started empty to find something that would change your life forever. The war would end someday. Humanity would win through creativity and determination, through officers like Jake who learned to think beyond the manual, through leaders like Lawson who understood that rules were tools, not chains. And when that day came, when the Kryn were defeated and humanity secured its place among the stars, Jake and Lawson would finally be able to meet openly, without disguises or secrets, just two people who changed the course of history because two black twins walked into a coffee shop and said, "Dad sends his apologies."